Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 292 of the podcast. It is November 9th, 2017. Today, our topic is something I've really taken an interest in the past 2 years. It's a methodology called motivational interviewing. I think it's a powerful methodology that will help anybody in their lean transformation efforts, as well as our work engaging anybody in a small improvement. Motivational interviewing, or MI, is defined by Miller and Rollnick in their seminal textbook as a collaborative conversation for strengthening a person's own motivation and commitment to change. So my guests today are three co-authors of an excellent book also on this topic. It's called Motivational Interviewing for Leadership, MI Lead. They are Jason Wilcox, the Director of Education and Connected Care at VA Roseburg, Dr. Brian Kersh, Clinical Psychologist at the New England VA Health System, and Dr. Elizabeth Jenkins, a Clinical Psychologist and Courtesy Assistant Professor at University of South Florida. So Brian and Beth are licensed clinical psychologists, and Jason is a licensed clinical social worker. You can learn more about them, their book, and the training and coaching they offer by visiting their MI for Leaders website at miforleaders.com. If you're looking for just one book on this subject, I do recommend reading MI Lead, the book we're talking about today. The original textbook by Miller and Rollnick is surprisingly readable, I thought, but the book we're discussing today gives a great introduction to the methodology, but then quickly turns to workplace change issues instead of clinical therapy situations. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and find it as thought-provoking and helpful as I did as I learned about this method. If you'd like to find a link to their book, their website, their bio, and more, you can go to leanblog.org/292. Well, again, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Jason Wilcox, Brian Kersh, and Beth Jenkins. I want to thank all of you for being here. And to jump right in, Brian, if you can start off by giving a bit of an overview about what is meant by the phrase in the method motivational interviewing. How do you see that helping people?
Thank you, Mark. Sure, just to jump in, so motivational interviewing is a way of communicating with other people to help them resolve their ambivalence around change by really eliciting and strengthening their own motivation for change. So that would be sort of a kind of a nice overview of what's meant by motivational interviewing. And did you have a second part to that question?
Well, so what's the intent, or maybe a better way of asking is some of the origins of this method as a way of helping people?
Sure. Well, it started in really treating addictions and in particular alcohol use disorders. And it was very different than the traditional approach of sort of, badgering people into change or, kind of forcing them to change by confronting them and telling them why they needed to change and how to go about doing it. So it's a real shift in that you're, rather than forcing or try to coerce somebody to change, you're really making change come from them, which is really where it comes from in the first place, right? So motivational interviewing is about how do we help people change by having them identify their own how and why around change. And so it started in addictions, and it quickly demonstrated itself to be very effective in that area, and then moved into other areas of changing behavior, like the healthcare setting, and then even in the legal setting. And now we're seeing it used in other settings as well.
As an engineer, not a psychologist speaking here, reading about motivational interviewing, it's interesting to think that, that attempts to badger people would be effective in a clinical setting. I can see why badgering people into change isn't effective in a workplace. What led to a recognition that there was some potential for potential benefit of trying a different approach? What were some of the origins of that?
Well, in the workplace, this is Beth. In the workplace, we've all seen whether it's individual change or organizational change. We've all seen that there are opportunities for change to happen. There are times that change needs to happen, and as we were, all three of us, doing a fair amount of training with folks using motivational interviewing, when looking at individual change, we began to see that it had great applications in organizations itself, and for leaders who are struggling to engage the folks they're working with and be successful without sacrificing their own agendas.
Yeah, and maybe that we can come back and touch on this point later, the difference between a clinical therapy setting where the focus is on, hopefully on the patient's needs, in a workplace that perhaps gets a little bit more complicated when there are organizational needs that a manager or leader feels obligated to push as opposed to just evoking. Or do you have a quick thought on that, Beth?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be a real dance because you've got multiple agendas at play, and they're not always obviously the same. And it can take some real collaboration to find a shared agenda.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back and touch on that topic of how to find that shared agenda. But just in terms of context, how just in terms of history, when did motivational interviewing evolve or become used in the original addiction setting? Is it decades, or what's the time frame?
Yeah, I believe it became more well known as it was introduced at a conference. If I have this correct, I believe it was around 1983. Bill Miller was at a conference. Prior to that conference, he had been on a sabbatical, and some of the folks that he was working with while on sabbatical were curious about his approach to working with addictions, because he was very effective, but his approach wasn't just like everyone else's. And so they began to meet and have some brown bag luncheons where they could pick his brain and get a better understanding of why he was doing what he was doing and what was behind the choice points along the way. And as he heard himself speak, he will often tell folks he came to this model of motivational interviewing, and it has grown exponentially since that time. But he first introduced the theory at a conference in 1983.
And I'm kind of fascinated by the idea that I wonder if within the addiction therapy world there was resistance to this new approach. I'm wondering how the creators of motivational interviewing figure out how to lead people to even investigate this. I think a lot of the listeners of this podcast struggle with, the idea that, they feel like they have a methodology, namely lean, that they think is better, and they're frustrated that people might not embrace that. I imagine there must have been a similar evolution within the clinical therapy realm, if any of you would be interested in commenting on that.
So I'll jump in. This is Brian. I think the main resistance at first is any time you have a new therapy, including one that's, pretty significantly different from what's in vogue at the time, you're going to have resistance, just as there's resistance to any change, right, which is quite germane to our conversation. And so, this was radically different from a lot of what was being done at the time, which tended, especially in the addictions world, to be much more confrontational. It's also very different from the Alcoholics Anonymous, the AA approach. Although you may see some parallels within there, it doesn't focus on the need for a higher power. You don't have to confess that you have a problem, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the main resistance at the time was the fact that, it was very different than other sort of therapeutic approaches for treating addictions. Where it came to be accepted over time is, one, many counselors finding it maybe more consistent with their sort of natural therapeutic style, which a lot of us were as therapists, were trained to be human-centered or client-centered or patient-centered, and motivational interviewing fits with that nicely. And of course, over time, the more it was studied, the more it demonstrated a strong evidence base around its use, which made it be more adopted as well.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that always, stands out to me when I'm reading about motivational interviewing is the idea that something new can be rationally better, and people may even say, yeah, I know it would be better to do such and such. But maybe, if one of you can elaborate on this idea of ambivalence, in a workplace setting where leaders or individuals might say, yeah, they might express a desire or a need to do something. Why does that often get people stuck in a state of ambivalence instead of moving forward?
So, Mark, this is Jason. You're talking about the ambivalence that comes naturally with an employee in a workplace as change comes about and different things happen, correct?
Yeah, and if you can elaborate on that, on how that state of ambivalence is natural. It's not meant to be a negative label any more than, how you point out in the book that resistance shouldn't be used as a way of labeling something as, pathological. It's quite natural, right?
Right. And so ambivalence is the same as you're stating. Ambivalence is a normal state for anybody to be in. And it's often just the reality that we see two sides to things. Employees, as change comes about, we love the way that things have been. We appreciate what we've been able to demonstrate, the way that we've been able to show success, and all of a sudden this new change comes in. So it like shocks the system. And then we can see how possibly the benefits are going forward. And so we get this mixed bag of the pros and cons of staying the same and staying in the same processes that we're comfortable in, or possibly changing into these new processes, and the benefits of that, or possibly consequences of that. And so it just becomes this natural, state for employees to feel once change comes about in an organization, and leaders start talking about that change. They start feeling that ambivalence.
I might add to that too what Jason was saying, which is that it's kind of a normal part of any type of change. We have, each of us, an awareness when we're ambivalent of the reasons for and the reasons not for, and it's really about sorting through that. So it's when we come at it from the approach of motivational interviewing, we really look at ambivalence as a really normal, expected part of the process.
Yeah, and I think one reflection I have after being as an early student of motivational interviewing, still early in my learning about this. I start becoming more aware in my own mind, or sometimes seeing in the writing of others, when I think it's a common topic in the lean world, where somebody has an approach that's clearly, rationally better, and resistance comes up. And it seems like a lot of people are quick then to label those resistors as bad, and we need to start moving people out of the organization. And can you talk more about this idea of having a conversation about change, a discussion? How is that resistance something to how do you resolve? What are some of the tactics for resolving that ambivalence instead of just saying, oh, they're resistant, they're bad, we need to force them to change?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And first of all, it's important to recognize that as leaders, we have a definite role and an impact with regard to where the people we're leading are in the change process. And what I mean by that is we think that just simply writing an employee off, labeling that employee as resistant or not a team player is inaccurate. And instead, we recognize that as leaders, we have a role in how motivated that individual is towards changing. So recognizing what you just heard, that ambivalence is a normal part of the change process, that's in our personal lives, that's at work as well, right? And so when an employee is normally and naturally not 100% on board with change, it behooves us as leaders to work with them, and before we have them jump into that change process, have them identify really why they might want to change. What do they see the benefits of change being? How might they go about implementing the change? How does this change fit into the employee's values and goals? And we recognize that once the employee starts to identify their reasons for change, their how and their why to change, they're much more likely to jump on to the change being discussed, and then and only then do we go forward with sort of implementing the change plan.
Yeah, and you know what you talk about there, asking the individual to articulate why change is important. I mean, I think that's pretty revolutionary, because I think within the lean framework, people are on board with asking employees for input about the what and the how, but I think there's still, and I've been guilty of this myself, of trying to explain the why, and telling the why, and it seems like that's an important lesson, motivational interviewing, that we should draw that out. Do you find in workplaces that the employee motivation for change is hopefully well aligned with the organization? Is that part of the role of leaders to create that sort of alignment?
Oh, I was just going back to how you said, sometimes it just comes out naturally that we want to explain the why, and we want to, just give them the information. But if we look at that, right, when we explain the why, our why may not be a motivator for somebody else. We need their why, right? And so you're identifying that important issue of allowing them to identify what is going to drive them to go forward. Like in the healthcare setting, I think of a lot of different examples, but I had a leader one time when I was training him. We were talking about some of these concepts. He said, I don't want to be going down this road. I want to be able to just tell people this is what you need to do, and then go and do it. And so we kind of talked about that and fleshed that out of, okay, well, what normally happens when you do that? What kind of responses do you get? And he was able to start identifying some of the pushback you might get. And when we look at this, like in a healthcare setting, possibly what we're just about to change truly might be beneficial, or even more beneficial for a patient. But if we tell the why and we just tell people what to do, that motivation might be missing, or that ambivalence we didn't process through well and help identify some of their desire to go forward. And so when we take the time to see what's going on with them and pull out those motivations within them and guide that and help that grow, that's when you see people really flourish, grab onto change, and make it their own.
And Beth, what did you...
Oh, I was just thinking about a quote, and it's interesting because the quote was made back in the 1600s, but Pascal, he said that people are generally better persuaded by the reasons which they have themselves discovered than by those which have come into the mind of others. And despite the fact that this came out in the 1600s and motivational interviewing really didn't begin to take shape until the 1980s, it's the heart and soul of motivational interviewing, which is that if the reasons do not come from the changer's mouth, if they do not come from within the person who's considering change, that even if somebody attempts change for a short period of time for somebody else's reasons, they don't generally stick. And we've had decades and decades now of research looking at motivational interviewing across multiple populations where we've seen that. And that's there's good and bad in that. The good news is that at any given time we can see how is this conversation that we are having with an individual or this interaction with an organization, how is it going based on what we're getting back. If we're getting back what we call change talk, which is any statements about somebody's desire or ability, reasons, need for change, if we're getting those kind of statements from the individual who's considering change, we're on the right track. That's actually predictive of change. On the other hand, if we are trying to kind of shove down somebody's throat all of the reasons that we can think of that support change, the reasons that make sense to us, those things coming out of our mouths are not predictive of change, and actually can have the opposite effect by pulling what we call sustained talk from the potential changer. In other words, all those arguments for why they can't, the yes buts that we often hear when we're trying to encourage somebody.
I mean, it seems like there's this sort of a fractal problem here, where there's the challenge of if you and you're authors of a book, and I guess in a book a book is a telling approach, and I say this as an author too, there's no other way about it. A book is sort of telling people here is a methodology, it's better, it gets better results, it fits better with the way people are. How do you apply, maybe you're talking with leaders about this, how do you apply some of the MI concepts so that you don't fall back on, telling them you need to embrace this and telling them why? I mean, you need sort of evoke the reasons for change about this new approach to change, right?
Yes. It's like voluntold. The people who come to some of our workshops were voluntold that they had to come, which is completely the opposite of what we're going to discuss with them. Yes.
And I would say it's an invitation, right?
Yeah.
We invite them to learn the material. And, sometimes we have those, like I brought up with that leader before, who really this was against what he felt was the right way to be a leader. And the best we can do is invite them to give it a try. And we use some of the same skills that we talk about here. We use some open-ended questions to see where their thoughts are. We reflect some of their thinking and feelings upon the topic, and help guide and open a door for them to possibly try out some of these skills. We definitely don't try to, we do our best not to go in there and just force them or tell them this is how it has to be, or this is the best way, or, you have to change into doing this kind of leadership.
Yeah, and it's just, it seems like that reminds me back to leaders who say, well, I just want to tell people what to do. Imagine if we think back, why are people, why do people stay in that status quo? Leaders would say, maybe, well, it's we don't have time to engage everybody in a discussion. I know what the answer is, and we're under a lot of pressure, and but it is. I mean, have you seen it maybe in workplace settings where that directive telling approach, it's either creates false starts or. I think there's a Toyota-ism when people talk about going slow to go fast. It seems like MI might fall into that. You make that investment into the conversation, and that's it's a good investment because it actually helps affect change. What are your thoughts on that idea?
Oh, absolutely. We, just for example, obviously we're not all perfect, and sometimes in our rush of a day, we forget to practice our own skills. And case in point, I had one employee who I really needed him to get a project done that I needed him to do. And I needed it done at a certain time in it. And I just brought him in and said, hey, I need you to get X, Y, and Z done by this date. And he's like, oh, sure. And he leaves. And this is one of my top employees, right? He does an excellent job in what he does. And the next day I know things weren't getting done. And I bring him in. I'm like, what's going on? And he had every excuse under the sun. And this wasn't atypical behavior of him. And all of a sudden I caught myself realizing I hadn't invested the time, right, to talk to him and ask some of the questions and use some of the motivational interviewing to kind of find out where he's at and his thoughts on it and guide him on it as well. And as soon as I backed up took the proper steps. It's funny how things all of a sudden, he had some ideas that he wanted to throw in there, and it got really creative and really exciting. And then next thing I know, I ended up with a better product than what I even thought I was going to have in the end.
Well, it seems like, a great example of taking that time, making that investment. Can you, Jason, or maybe somebody else talk about? I think there's one other element, it seems, of human nature that comes out in the discussion of MI. There's the idea that ambivalence is normal, resistance is normal. Can you talk about the phrase "the writing reflex"? It seems like as much as it's tempting to say, leaders, you shouldn't tell people what to do, you shouldn't give them answers. Can you talk about how there's some human nature involved there, where we should maybe kind of be understanding about people who are trying to write others?
So I'll jump in. This is Brian. The writing reflex, we develop this as leaders. We develop this as healthcare providers. It's the urge to want to jump in and help. It's the urge to want to jump in and fix, right? And as leaders and as healthcare providers, we have strong problem-solving skills. It's what's got us here in the first place, whether that's a leader in an organization or, for instance, again, a healthcare provider. You have to know how to solve problems, and you have to be able to jump in there and fix. And at times, this certainly has a time and a place. When somebody is ready, when somebody is gung-ho for change, having a leader tell them what to do and how to do it can be helpful. The problem is when we're ambivalent, having somebody tell us what to do and how to do it, really it gives voice to only one side of this internal dialogue that's going on in our minds. And so what we tend to do, being an ambivalent person, when somebody's telling us what to do and how to do it, we argue back. As Beth said earlier, we say, yeah, but, because we're giving voice to the side of the argument in our heads that the leader is not giving voice to. So while we're not saying a leader should never offer ideas around what to do and how to do it, it's best to resist that writing reflex initially, especially while the employee or team member is still ambivalent, and instead encourage that team member really to be the voice of champion, to not have it come from us as the leader, but to have it come from the employee or the team member instead. So rather than pushing on one side of the ambivalence and eliciting the other, we're going to elicit the side for change as the leader. And we're going to only offer that what to do and how to do it when the employee is ready for it, when he or she is asking for it in order to take steps towards change.
Mm-hmm. And that's once that point, the stage of commitment has been reached, when it would be less dysfunctional to plan together, to give direction, once there's agreement to move forward on solving a problem or moving forward on a path.
Right, it becomes a collaboration.
Right, exactly. So once there's that readiness for change, kind of a commitment to change from the team member, and again, they're wanting additional information, then as leaders, obviously, we've gotten to where we are for a reason, and part of that reason is we have knowledge, we have expertise, we have the ability to solve problems. So of course we can share that, but again, it's when the team member is wanting it, when they're asking for it, when they're not generating it on their own, and when they're ready for change.
So maybe, if it's okay, let's come back to earlier. I think Beth used the phrase, the dance of change, when there might be misaligned agendas, different agendas within the organization. Can you talk a little bit about the process for helping work through that? How long? I imagine a lot of these times it's not just a simple, quick discussion that leads to some magic outcome, that it's a process, it takes time. I don't know if you have another example that might help illustrate a situation like that.
Yeah. I was thinking perhaps I'll describe the process a little bit, and then I'm thinking about some of the examples that I know Jason may have and some of the work that he's done, and we might let him share there. But when we're as leaders having a discussion with somebody about potential change, the first step is really not jumping into the hows, which is what Brian was just alluding to, but really talking to the person in a way that shows our curiosity. And so oftentimes when I'm doing trainings, I will tell folks, put your curious hat on. So asking questions, hearing the individual, what is their point of view, what are their thoughts, what are their values, what are their goals, and then how does the agenda that you as a leader are bringing to the table potentially fit in with that? So by starting with a listening stance and then working with that individual to move into more of that problem-solving stance, we're much more likely to get to a shared agenda, a shared focus that's collaborative and ends in the results that we both perhaps are looking for. Jason, I'm wondering if you have a couple of examples that you'd be willing to share, because I know I've heard you tell some good ones.
Sure. There was one leader I was working with who she struggled to figure out ways to communicate with her staff. The problem was that she would often tell me she felt like she would try to talk with them, but she just felt so disconnected. And so we really came down to some of the core concept of finding that shared agenda, of meeting the people where they're at, and finding how do we go forward where we both meet, going, how do I put it, where we both feel good about the direction we're going in. And so her and I started talking, and she gave me a situation where she was talking with the staff on trying to adopt some changes down in a clinic that they were working in. And so she talked about how she went down there, saw what was happening, said, no, you guys need to be doing it, this way and that way, and started getting very directive with them. And she was telling me, I don't get it, right? I mean, I tell them that, and it seems like this is the fifth time I've told them over and over. And so we kind of went over some different ideas and, okay, well, have you thought about going down and just sitting with them and just saying, okay, what is it that might be beneficial if we go this direction? And taking some time to hear from them and their voices. And we practice, using some of the semi-lead. And she left, came back. And when she came back, she told me how great it went. She said, it totally changed the conversation. And she was really funny because she literally couldn't sit in her chair. She was talking, behind her desk, just all excited. And she's like, oh my gosh, it made such a difference when I just sat there and started using some of these things that I thought were so simple. Even when you were telling me, this part was amusing to me, what she said, it's, even when you were telling me these things, it was like, well, I don't get why that's going to work, because it's just so simple, right? Just doing some of these little steps, little techniques is going to make such a difference. And so she said, yeah, they had a really great response. She started hearing some of their concerns and some of the things that they really wanted to see in the clinic. And she was able to start kind of guiding them to seeing how that kind of fits in the same model where they're both going and wanting what they want to do with the patient. And over time, as we kept discussing, she was able to come back and say that the change, persisted, and they even started coming up with more ideas, right? That creativeness often comes out when people are using MI Lead with their employees, and they got really excited, and, it became a very top-notch clinic.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, and thinking back to the story from earlier, there's a really compelling argument there that taking that time, that input leads to better solutions. And to me, that seems like, the collaboration that we often see in a quote unquote lean culture, this idea that leaders are getting input instead of being expected to have all the answers themselves. But I still think this collaboration, this discussion around the reasons why is still something that jumps out to me. And I mean, this is one reason MI has resonated with me. I'm reminded of a quick story. I was working with a hospital in their laboratory, and they had great leadership in the lab, and we were going into microbiology. And the lab director and the chief pathologist certainly had their ideas of reasons why lean was going to be important. And I forget the genesis of it, but we decided and they said, okay, Mark, you're an outsider, and we agreed. I would just go in and have a very open-ended discussion. And I knew some of these folks because I wasn't brand new to the organization, but asking, why should we improve things in microbiology? And they talked about clinical quality, and they talked about their workload. And I think, the director was afraid to bring up the issue of overtime. We need to reduce overtime. Well, sure enough, that was one of the things the employees brought up, because they wanted to get home on time, and the director was afraid it would be viewed as cutting their paycheck. And they discovered in that case there was great alignment. And I wonder how it would have worked out if he had. Well, I guess we would predict the answer, but I'll wrap up the story. I'm curious your thoughts. If he had pushed on them the idea, we need to reduce overtime, they would have likely pushed back.
Well, we all like to feel like we have some degree of autonomy. That is human nature. And if I ever forget that, when I come home at the end of the day, I have 2 teenagers, and they never fail to remind me how important it is, just that sense of having choices. So if my daughter comes in and I tell her when she comes in, you need to unload your backpack, you need to pick up your room, and you need to set the table, I'm going to get an argument. But if I ask her what her thoughts are about what's going to help the night move along so that we can get to this delicious dinner that we smell cooking, she's probably going to come up with some of those ideas on her own. It's really about the way we approach it and whether or not we're supporting that need that all of us have to feel like we have some input. And we push back when we don't.
And they, those employees may or may not have necessarily pushed back, but what you might have seen is some of the employees just walk away from it going, man, he's taking away our ability to have overtime. And feel a little bit grumpy about it. And the others feeling happy that he did do it, taking away this overtime. But you can end up with that because they might move to the other side of that spectrum with that ambivalence.
Yeah.
Especially if they're sitting on the fence in the beginning. The people who are already convinced one way or another are less of a concern. They are there. But the folks that are on the fence and have reasons to go both ways, it's not too difficult to tip it by pushing too hard, and then they're going to right that canoe, if you will, by going the other direction.
Can I just highlight one thing you said, Mark, that I really liked about how the leaders, we don't always have to have the answers. And it's interesting, when I first ever started teaching motivational interviewing, just more in the clinical world, I used to love showing clinical staff how motivational interviewing allows us not to always have to have the answers. And it's nice to allow that organic answer to come out of the person. And it's the same as leaders. It's really empowering, and it makes you feel like this great collaborative leader and make things happen when it's this organic, natural thing that comes out of the employee that you're helping guide out of them, and not having to always have these answers, and not always having to try to get people to follow your directions and your answers that you bring to the table and stuff. So, yeah.
And I think I like one thing I really like is this concept of the spirit of MI, and I think there's parallels to the lean methodology where we all have stories. I'm sure every listener has one of somebody using a tool in a way that violated some spirit of lean, and it's probably fair to say that motivational interviewing is there certain ethics around these tools, these methods shouldn't be misapplied. This is not about a leader having a new way of manipulating people into doing what they want to do. Are there any kind of cautions, or is it sort of impossible to misuse this because people will detect that and check out? And
I don't believe it's impossible to avoid misusing it. We take pains to talk about the ethical application of motivational interviewing in our book because of the potential for misuse. motivational interviewing works. And, it works to help people make change. And it can be, and it's powerful, right? So there's all sorts of potential for misuse. And the developers of motivational interviewing, which are Bill Miller and Steve Rollnick, and certainly others have contributed over the years, in the third edition of their book, of the sort of core motivational interviewing book, they explicitly added the component of compassion to the spirit of MI. And the idea being that the way they define compassion is what we're doing is in the best interest of the person we're working with. So what we're doing as a clinician is in the best interest of the patient. What we're doing as a leader is in the best interest of the people that we are leading. And they included this explicitly because they had actually already seen, and partly in the business world, where people were learning MI really to manipulate the other people that they were working with. For instance, people in sales were using it to improve their sales. And they weren't necessarily doing this in the best interest of the people they were selling the product to, so much as in the best interest of themselves as the salespeople. And so I think you really have to be cautious as a leader, because it's tempting, especially when you have leaders above you, it's tempting to get your team, your staff, to achieve the goal by any means necessary. And so motivational interviewing is meant to be pro-social. It is meant to be helpful to the people that you're using motivational interviewing with. And so we spend a lot of time discussing the spirit for just that reason, because there is the temptation there, right, for the leader to use this powerful technique to force his or her staff members to make a change. And we really want it to be about helping people who have come to the conclusion themselves that it's in their own best interest to make a change.
Yeah, and I think that's where the workplace dynamic comes up again, where a lot of leaders might say, well, sure, the ideal is to be a servant leader, and some people might say, yeah, you take care of the employees and they'll take care of the patients. But imagine there's times where people say, look, the organization expects me to achieve certain goals, and but it seems it comes back to that view of a leader viewing sometimes employees as a means to their end instead of engaging them as leaders, like one of you said earlier, like the role that leaders have in their employees' motivation. I don't know if that was a question or a statement I just rambled through, but does anyone have a reaction, a better thought to build upon my rambling?
We could misuse some of the aspects of motivational interviewing to try to achieve a change that benefits us as leaders. I would hope that folks would not, but certainly folks could. The potential downside, I think, is that while on the front end you may get whatever it is that you are after, at what cost is that in a long-term relationship with that employee or supervisee? And motivational interviewing at its core is about the relationship that you have with that individual and the investment that you're putting into that individual. And certainly if there were positions where we are leading folks for whom we have no vested interest in and could replace without any loss, we might not choose to use motivational interviewing because the relationship and that engagement is such a core piece of what it is that we are doing. And so by definition, we are kind of pulling in some of that servant leadership. You think about, most of us have had a leader at some point, or a supervisor or a boss at some point in our careers that has been that transformational leader, the one that's really inspired us to go above and beyond the basic expectations of our job. And when we think about the folks that really embody what a transformational leader is, They genuinely care about our well-being as well as their own, and from that, it is a long-term investment that pays off, and the dividends are ongoing. So we could misuse it. It would probably be short-lived.
I was going to say, I'd just add that, it's always fun to sit down with some of the leaders that I've worked with over the years, and when they want to throw situations out at me, right, and we'll kind of process them and talk about how this applies and how could we use it, because if you're used to some of the other models of leadership, it might be, you might kind of sit back and go back to why, how could this really work? And so it's always fun to sit down, talk about the situations, how could you apply it? But then also at times they'll bring up situations that motivational interviewing is definitely not appropriate, right? And so my point being is some of the techniques aren't appropriate for every situation with an employee. And that's just something that leaders need to identify. When is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate? We can always carry the spirit of motivational interviewing with us in all situations, but at the same time, all the techniques aren't appropriate for every situation.
Yeah. Well, and as we start, and I think thank you for clarifying that there might be a time to be directive and don't misuse MI and recognize you're not practicing those at the time. But I think, I imagine a lot of listeners having the same thought that, what I take away from MI and I see where this would be really compatible with a lean or Toyota type culture are elements of not just respect for people at a really, deep and meaningful level, but taking the long-term perspective, as you pointed out, Beth. Point number one of the Toyota way management philosophy says make decisions, for what I'm paraphrasing, what's best for the long term, even at the expense of the short term. And that's something that a lot of organizations don't try to emulate. But what I hear out of this is, the longer term perspective combined with servant leadership, respect for people, engaging people is a great approach. So as a kind of final question here, other than your book, which I of course do highly recommend to listeners, Motivational Interviewing for Leadership. You can find it on Amazon. You can get it as a Kindle book as well. Do any of you have thoughts of, what would you recommend someone, they've read the book, how and when would it be appropriate for somebody to try to practice some of these methods, or at least, to get started?
I would say is when you're reading it, as you read it, in fact, in the book, we give lots of exercises, and we would encourage you to start giving the different techniques a try. It's one of those things that once you go out and start trying them, you'll start noticing the power of them.
And you don't need to be formally certified to try to use some of these approaches, right?
One of the things that we teach people almost immediately when we're teaching motivational interviewing are 4 core skills that are client-centered, and those are open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. And oftentimes people will begin by just practicing open-ended questions. They'll practice reflecting what they hear other folks saying to them, and that's something that we can do in just about any situation. Pretty much anyone loves to be listened to, even if we're practicing our listening skills. And so there are opportunities in all different formats to begin to utilize some of those skills and see what happens.
And certified, no, they don't need to be certified, but obviously, as people start trying some of these skills, they'll find that they're more complex than what they seem like on the surface. And that's where training might be needed, right? And so where they can go to a training and get much more, in-depth skill building inside of that training.
I'll just piggyback real quick on both what Beth and Jason are saying. As you start to try out some of these skills, your employees, your staff members, your team members will give you immediate feedback on whether or not you're using the skills. If your team members are more engaged, if they're talking more about change, if they're generating ideas and solutions and reasons for making the change, if they're getting energized, then you're moving in the right direction. And so I think that's one of the neat things about just getting started with some of the skills. And then to Jason's point around additional training, one of the things, and you may have been about to ask about this, but we are available, three of us are available for trainings, for coaching. So if anybody's wanting additional assistance learning these skills, that's available from us, and it's available from others as well.
Okay. Well, I will. I am interested in that, so I will follow up offline. But that's good to know that that you're able to help. And it's just one other thought I'll add before kind of ask each of you for a final thought. As I've gone through and read the books, and I took a workshop and just a day-long class. I've found even individually, I think have a better understanding of my own ambivalence in certain circumstances. And if I notice change talk and I my own inner monologue, I try to think how to steer myself toward the positive change talk that is more indicative of change. I think maybe I don't know if anyone else finds a personal starting point as a way of thinking through some of these concepts before working with others. So maybe ask each of you to give a final thought, whether it's on a reaction to that or anything else you'd like to leave the listeners with. Maybe start with Beth.
Sure. Kind of along the lines of what you were just saying about listening for change talk, I really use that as a gauge at any given time, that I want to know, how is this conversation going with this individual? Am I making progress, or am I making things not as good as they could have been? And I know by whether or not I'm getting change talk. So if I'm getting change talk, what I'm doing is headed in the right direction. If I'm getting the opposite, if I'm getting arguments against, what we call sustained talk, I know I need to adjust my sails a bit and perhaps shift direction. And it's just a very gentle guide for me so that I know how it's going at any given point. Even if that person isn't completely ready to make a change in that moment, I can see what direction we're headed and whether we're making progress.
Great. Jason, do you have kind of a final thought for the listeners?
Yeah, I keep having a thought going through my mind as we've been going through this call, and I'll just kind of give it here as my own personal why I chose motivational interviewing for leadership. And it goes back to, I've been working with training leaders and coaching leaders for a number of years now, but I've also been training and coaching people in motivational interviewing. And it was probably a good 4 years ago, I was sitting down with an executive one day, coaching him on leadership skills. And she all of a sudden looks at me and goes, "You MI'd me again, didn't you?" And I don't know why it never connected so well for me before that moment, but it really connected at that moment of, oh my gosh, yeah, that's the reality. I've coached and trained people in a lot of different leadership models, but I really like what motivational interviewing brings to the table, and I started coaching and training and working with people more on motivational interviewing in a leadership style and a model, and that's kind of where it all started to grow and develop, and just seeing it in my own personal experience.
That's great. And Brian, would you like to add a final thought?
Yes, I'm quite happy to. We hear terms like transformational leader, servant leader, lean manager, and I think for us, what MI has given us is a way to really put these sort of different leadership methods and approaches into practice. And I think that's what really sort of, at least for me, and I think I speak for Jason and Beth, really appeals to us about motivational interviewing. I remember being brought into this lean project working with a clinic to help them improve access so that patients could get in quicker to see the clinicians there. And the team already had a good green belt leader working with them, but it wasn't until we took, and I signed up to, this was a yellow belt project for me, and the green belt was there to be my mentor. And it was really once we started asking the team for their ideas. They had sort of stagnated before, the team and the green belt leader had sort of stagnated in going forward until we really took a step back, and I worked with the team and asked them why they would want to improve access. How did this fit into what their goals and values were? And the team had been doing nothing in terms of coming up with PDSA cycles, for instance, and projects that they could work on. But once they were able to tell us how improving access would actually help them meet the mission of taking care of their patients and help them be more effective and more efficient, once they articulated their reasons, they all of a sudden started to come up with multiple projects that they then started working on. So I just found it was a nice way, and in a way I hadn't thought of until working on that project, of really putting lean management into practice. So I think any of your listeners who are interested in learning how to be good, effective lean managers, I think this is one strategy, one practical strategy, one practical approach that they could learn to actually do that.
Well, that's great. I hope this will inspire people to do so. You know, I've been talking with colleagues of mine around the country this year about motivational interviewing, and I know it's prompted some others to go and read the book and get similarly excited about these ideas like I have, and hopefully this podcast will prompt some other listeners to do that. So I'd love to hear what people think. If you want to come and comment on the blog page, the post for this episode. I know people can find the book on Amazon. Final question, how can people reach out to you if they are interested in some training or coaching?
I would probably have them just go to our website that we're currently updating. And on that website will be contact information for Beth, Brian, and myself, Jason.
And what is that website?
miforleaders.com.
Okay, great. We'll link that.
Yep.
Link to that on the page as well. So again, our guests today have been Jason Wilcox, Brian Kersh, Beth Jenkins. It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing with us on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.